Chapter 1. The Cat Who Would Not Leave. London can hold millions of people and still make one person feel invisible. In 2007, James Bowen was living in sheltered accommodation in Tottenham and trying to recover from heroin addiction. Most days were about getting through the next few hours. Then, on the steps of his building, he noticed an injured ginger cat. The cat looked hungry. His coat was dirty. There was a wound on his leg. James assumed he belonged to someone, so he asked around. Nobody claimed him. James had almost no money and very little certainty in his own life, but he could not walk past an animal that needed help. He took the cat for treatment. The antibiotics cost £28, nearly the last of what James had. It was an irrational decision if survival were only a calculation. But people do not rebuild their lives through calculation alone. Sometimes recovery begins when another living thing depends on you being present tomorrow. James named the cat Bob. He expected Bob to recover and leave. Bob had a different idea. For several days, James treated the arrangement as temporary. He made space for Bob in a life that barely had space for James himself. He checked the wound, measured out the medicine, found food, and watched the cat regain his confidence. Each small improvement became proof that care could produce a visible result. The wound became cleaner. Bob began to eat normally. His posture changed. He stopped looking like an animal waiting for the next danger. James had been living inside uncertainty for so long that tomorrow often felt abstract. Bob made tomorrow practical. There would be another dose of antibiotics, another meal, another check of the injured leg. Responsibility divided the day into manageable pieces. When the treatment was finished, James believed he had done what he could. He let Bob outside and expected the cat to return to whatever life he had known before. Instead, Bob waited. When James walked away, the ginger cat followed. At first, James tried to turn him back. London traffic was dangerous, and the streets were no place for an injured animal. But Bob continued behind him with the stubborn calm that would later become familiar to thousands of people. The image seems charming now, a cat choosing a man, but in that moment it created a serious question. James was still struggling to care for himself. Could he accept responsibility for another life? That question is the real hook of their story. Not whether Bob could become famous, not whether a book or film would follow. The first question was whether James could keep returning when someone depended on him. And Bob kept answering in the only way he could. He stayed. Chapter 2. The Life James Was Trying to Survive. Before Bob, James had spent years moving between rough sleeping, temporary places, and the edges of ordinary life. Addiction did not arrive as a single dramatic choice. James later described a world in which drugs could feel like a way to sleep, to escape the cold, or to quiet a life that seemed to offer no future. That context does not erase responsibility. It explains why recovery is more complicated than one brave decision. Housing, health, work, trust, and identity all have to be rebuilt at different speeds. James had already started that difficult work before Bob appeared. The public would eventually discover James through an extraordinary image, a street musician with a ginger cat sitting calmly beside him. But the image hid the quieter truth. He was not waiting for fame. He was trying to build enough routine to remain in recovery. Homelessness is often narrated as if it were an identity, something fixed inside a person. In reality, it is a condition produced by overlapping losses. Housing, money, health, relationships, documentation, safety, and the ability to imagine a stable future. A person can solve one problem and remain trapped by 5 others. James's move into sheltered accommodation mattered. It gave him a door and a place to return to, but a room is not the same as a recovered life. The habits formed during years of instability do not disappear when a key is placed in your hand. Trust must be relearned. Appointments must be kept. Isolation must be interrupted. The future must become believable again. This is why Bob's arrival did not begin James's recovery, and why the story should not erase the support that was already present. James had entered treatment. He had shelter. He was attempting to earn money through music. Bob entered a process already underway and changed its emotional center. To understand that process, it helps to understand how instability changes decision-making. When every day contains urgent problems, the mind learns to prioritize immediate relief. A long-term consequence can feel distant compared with tonight's cold, today's hunger, or the anxiety of not knowing where it is safe to rest. Choices that appear irrational from a stable home may feel entirely rational inside survival mode. This is also why advice can fail. Get a job assumes reliable sleep, clean clothes, identification, transport, and a place to keep belongings. Attend every appointment assumes a working phone, predictable travel, and enough emotional capacity to navigate institutions. Just stop using ignores withdrawal, trauma, and the environment in which substances may be constantly available. None of these barriers makes change impossible. They explain why progress is fragile. A missed bus can become a missed appointment. A stolen bag can remove documents. A night without sleep can make work impossible. One setback can trigger several more. Sheltered accommodation interrupted part of that chain for James. It did not solve everything, but it created a stable location from which other choices could become possible. This distinction matters. Housing is not a reward delivered after recovery. Often, housing is the condition that allows recovery work to continue. Bob entered this fragile new structure. The cat did not ask James to explain his history. He responded to consistency in the present. Every successful day of care became a small counterargument to the belief that James could not maintain a life. That counterargument accumulated. James could point to something real. Bob was healthier because James had acted. The medicine had been given. The food had been found. The animal who once looked injured and alone now followed him by choice. For someone carrying years of failure and rejection, visible evidence of competence can be more persuasive than encouragement. Bob's recovery offered that evidence. James could ignore his own hunger. Bob's hunger was harder to dismiss. He could tell himself that one missed appointment did not matter. A living companion made absence visible. Care created consequences, and consequences created structure. Chapter 3. Responsibility arrives on 4 paws. Bob needed food, medicine, and attention. That changed the shape of James's day. A person who feels disconnected from the future may struggle to make promises to himself. A hungry animal makes the future immediate. Mourning has a purpose. Money has a priority. Returning home matters. When Bob recovered, James tried to let him go. The cat followed him. Bob followed him down the street, onto buses, and toward the places where James played guitar. What began as temporary care became companionship. It is tempting to call this magic. It was not. Bob did not remove withdrawal, housing insecurity, or the consequences of James's past. What he offered was smaller and in many ways more powerful, a reason to practice responsibility every day. There was also a practical cost. Food for Bob came from the same limited money James needed for himself. Veterinary care could not be postponed simply because the week had been difficult. Travel became more complicated. A cat who followed him through London was not an accessory. He was a responsibility that could become frightened, injured, or lost. That pressure could have pushed James away. Instead, it gave his choices a visible audience of one. Bob did not understand promises about next month. He understood whether James returned, whether the food bowl was filled, and whether the hand reaching toward him was gentle. Trust grew through repetition. Bob learned the sounds of James's routine. James learned the small signals in Bob's posture, the difference between curiosity and fear, the moment the cat wanted to climb onto his shoulder, the moment he needed quiet. Their communication required attention. Attention pulled James outward from the closed loop of his own anxiety. This did not make every day hopeful. Some days responsibility feels less like inspiration and more like weight. That is part of why it works. A meaningful routine cannot depend on feeling motivated. It continues when the feeling disappears. James began to understand that caring for Bob and caring for himself were becoming connected. If James remained stable, Bob remained safe. If James planned the day, both of them ate. If he kept moving forward in treatment, the small home they shared became more secure. The emotional shift was quiet but profound. James was no longer only the person receiving help. He was someone capable of giving it. Chapter 4. Two figures on the streets of London. Together, James and Bob became hard to ignore. Bob sat near James while he busked, and later while he sold the big issue in Islington. Commuters who might once have passed without looking began to stop. James said that Bob made him visible. People bought the magazine. Some stayed to talk. Children smiled. Phones came out. The interaction often began with the cat, but it created a bridge to the person beside him. Visibility can be both kindness and pressure. Being noticed does not automatically mean being understood. Yet those small conversations returned something homelessness often removes: participation in public life. On a busy pavement, people make decisions in seconds. Look forward. Avoid eye contact. Keep walking. James had experienced what it meant to become part of the background. A person can be physically present in the center of a city and still be treated as if he occupies no social space at all. Bob interrupted that reflex. A ginger cat calmly watching commuters created curiosity before judgment had time to close the door. Someone would stop to ask the cat's name. Another person would notice James's guitar. A customer buying the big issue might stay for a short conversation. The exchange was small, but it changed both sides. James was no longer approached only as a problem, a warning, or a request for money. He became the man who knew this unusual cat, the musician at a familiar corner, the vendor people expected to see again. Recognition creates accountability. Regular customers notice absence. They ask how the week has been. They remember details. For someone rebuilding stability, these weak social ties can matter. They are not intimate friendships, but they confirm that a person has a place in the shared world. There was tension inside this visibility. Some people saw Bob before they saw James. Cameras could turn a relationship into a novelty. A crowd might gather for the charming image and leave without understanding the years of instability behind it. James nevertheless found a way to use the attention. Bob's presence opened the conversation. James's work sustained it. He still had to play the music. He still had to sell the magazine. He still had to return the next day. The pair became memorable because their bond appeared genuine. Bob was not restrained into a pose. He chose proximity. He sat on James's shoulders, waited beside him, and followed him through a city where almost everyone else was in a hurry. That image carried a question people could feel even before they could explain it. What does loyalty look like when neither life has much security? Chapter 5. When strangers began to notice. The story traveled beyond a London pavement. Images and videos circulated. A literary opportunity followed, and in 2012, James's account became a street cat named Bob. The book reached readers around the world and later inspired screen adaptations. From the outside, this looked like the perfect ending. An injured cat, a man in recovery, and a chance encounter transformed into international success. But a marketable ending is not the same as a finished life. Fame changed James's circumstances. It did not make him immune to grief, pressure, or the long aftereffects of instability. The most important chapter was still the one that could not be condensed into a headline, continuing to show up. The publication of the book changed the scale of attention. The pavement encounters had been local and immediate. Now strangers in other countries knew James and Bob as symbols of hope. Readers brought their own experiences to the story: recovery, loneliness, grief, and the healing presence of animals. Success brought opportunities that would once have seemed impossible. There were interviews, appearances, travel, and eventually films. The story sold because its central image was emotionally clear. Two lives that appeared lost had found each other. But clarity can become distortion. When a complicated life is shaped into a headline, the audience begins to expect the person to remain inside that headline. James was expected to represent redemption. Bob was expected to represent unconditional salvation. Ordinary setbacks could feel like a betrayal of the story people wanted to believe. This is a hidden pressure of public recovery. Privacy becomes limited at the same time that emotional stability is still being built. Strangers feel invested in the outcome. They may offer love, but they may also demand reassurance that the inspiring story remains true. James's success was real. So was the work that continued beneath it. Money can improve housing and reduce immediate danger, but it does not automatically repair years of trauma. Recognition can create belonging, but it can also create fear that acceptance depends on continuing to perform a role. Bob remained the constant element. The cat did not know the sales figures, the reviews, or the cameras. He recognized the same person who had stopped beside an injured animal and spent nearly his last money on medicine. That continuity mattered. Public life was changing quickly. Their private relationships still depended on the familiar things: food, touch, routine, and returning home. Chapter 6: The Danger of the Rescue Story. Audiences love rescue stories because they turn pain into a clean arc. Someone is lost. Something extraordinary happens. Everything becomes better. Real recovery rarely respects that structure. Bob was not a cure. James had housing support, medical help, work, and his own decisions behind him. The cat became part of that network, a companion and a daily obligation, not a replacement for it. Calling Bob a miracle may sound generous, but it can hide the labor James performed. It can also hide what other people experiencing homelessness need: safety, healthcare, stable housing, income, and relationships that do not disappear when attention moves elsewhere. The rescue version also changes the moral of the story. If one extraordinary encounter is presented as the solution, then people who never meet their Bob can appear responsible for remaining trapped. That conclusion is both inaccurate and cruel. There is another problem with the word saved. It turns one participant into an active hero and the other into a passive object. James and Bob's relationship worked because care moved in both directions. James rescued an injured cat in a practical sense. He found treatment, paid for medicine, and provided shelter. Bob changed James's life by creating attachment, routine, and connection. Neither story cancels the other. Mutual care is less dramatic than rescue because it does not happen once. It is negotiated every day. There are costs, frustrations, and limits. Bob could not understand every human difficulty. James could not guarantee that life would remain stable. Their bond mattered without being perfect. This more honest framing also protects James's agency. He chose to spend the money. He administered the medicine. He continued treatment. He worked. He spoke with customers. He collaborated on the book. Bob created motivation and opportunity, but James acted on them. Agency does not mean doing everything alone. The idea that success is only legitimate when achieved without help is another harmful myth. Human lives are networks of assistance: family, public services, doctors, employers, customers, friends, and sometimes animals. Independence is often the result of dependable relationships, not their absence. James's network was imperfect, but it expanded. The big issue offered a structure for earning. Customers created repeated social contact. Publishing professionals helped shape an opportunity. Readers provided an audience. Bob remained the emotional thread connecting the life before attention to the life after it. The takeaway is not that every person needs a pet. Animals also require money, housing, and care, and not every situation is safe for them. The takeaway is that responsibility becomes transformative when it is supported rather than punished. James had enough stability to care for Bob, and caring for Bob helped him use that stability. Both statements can be true. Companionship can be transformative. It is not a housing policy. Love can motivate someone to attend treatment. It cannot replace access to treatment. Responsibility can help create routine. It cannot guarantee income or protect a tenant from every crisis. James's story matters precisely because these layers work together. Sheltered accommodation created a safer base. Medical care supported recovery. Selling the big issue offered legitimate work and repeated contact with the public. Rioting created an opportunity to transform experience into income. Bob connected these parts emotionally. The cat gave James a relationship that did not begin with an assessment form, a diagnosis, or a demand to explain his past. Bob responded to the present. Was James here? Was he calm? Was there food? Was there safety? For a person who had been defined by past failures, that present-tense relationship offered relief. Trust could be earned today. It did not require rewriting yesterday. The real story is therefore less cinematic and more useful. Change accumulated. One choice supported the next. Care created routine. Routine supported work. Work created social contact. Social contact created opportunity. Opportunity increased stability. No single link explains the whole chain. Remove enough links, and the story may have ended differently. Chapter 7. What routine changed? Recovery is often made of ordinary actions that nobody films. Wake up, feed the cat, keep an appointment, sell another magazine, return home, try again tomorrow. Bob made those actions visible, but their repetition gave them power. James was not only caring for an animal, he was rebuilding evidence that he could be trusted, with money, with work, with another life, and eventually with his own future. That is why companionship can matter so deeply. It does not remove hardship. It changes the question from "Why should I continue?" to "Who needs me to return?" Routine also changed James's relationship with time. Street survival compresses attention into the immediate: where to sleep, how to stay warm, how to avoid danger, how to get through the night. Long-term plans become difficult when the present is unstable. Bob introduced a future measured in meals, veterinary appointments, familiar routes, and repeated mornings. None of these events was dramatic. Together they formed a calendar. A calendar is a quiet form of hope because it assumes there will be a tomorrow worth preparing for. There were social routines as well. James and Bob returned to recognizable places. Customers began to expect them. A pitch became more than a location to earn money. It became a place inside a community. This did not erase stigma, but it pushed against isolation. Work mattered for the same reason. Selling a magazine is an exchange. The vendor offers something of value. The customer makes a choice. That distinction can restore dignity to someone accustomed to being viewed only through need. Bob attracted attention, but James maintained the relationship with readers and customers. He learned which people wanted a photograph, which wanted conversation, and which simply wanted to buy an issue and continue their day. The work demanded patience, boundaries, and consistency. Recovery often sounds abstract from the outside. In practice, it is built from these ordinary competencies: arriving, waiting, speaking respectfully, managing disappointment, going home without abandoning the progress of the day. Bob did not perform those tasks for James. He made them feel connected to a life James valued. Chapter 8. Fame, Grief, and the Person Behind the Image. James and Bob remained together for roughly 13 years. Bob became a public figure in his own unusual way, but to James, he was family. When Bob died in June 2020, the public lost a familiar animal. James lost the companion connected to nearly every chapter of his rebuilt life. Grief does not invalidate recovery. It reveals how much the relationship mattered. The strongest version of this story is not that a cat fixed a broken man. It is that two vulnerable lives formed a bond, and caring changed what each day demanded. When a public animal dies, thousands of people may share memories, photographs, and condolences. That collective grief can be comforting. It can also make private pain feel exposed. Everyone remembers the symbol. Only the person closest to the animal loses the daily presence, the sound in the room, the familiar weight, the routine that existed before anyone else knew the story. For James, Bob was connected to almost every visible step of a transformed life. The cat had been there before the books, before the films, before international attention. Bob represented continuity between the man struggling in sheltered accommodation and the author recognized by strangers. Public memory tends to freeze relationships at their most recognizable moment. James and Bob remain in photographs, the street musician and the ginger cat. But 13 years contain ordinary aging. Routines change. Work changes. Homes change. The animal who once needed antibiotics becomes older and needs a different kind of care. That passage of time is important because it shows the relationship was not maintained for publicity. Long after the original novelty faded, the responsibilities remained. Feeding, veterinary care, companionship, and concern continued outside the camera frame. When Bob died, James was not only grieving an animal, he was grieving a witness to his transformation. Bob had known him before he was an author, before strangers treated his story as meaningful, before financial success altered his options. The cat connected identities that might otherwise have felt impossible to reconcile. Grief can make the future feel discontinuous. The routines that once organized a day suddenly point toward absence. A food bowl, a familiar route, or a quiet room can become evidence of what is gone. For someone whose recovery was closely linked to those routines, the loss can carry additional risk. This is where inspirational storytelling often becomes impatient. The audience wants the survivor to apply the lesson and continue forward. But grief is not a test of whether the earlier recovery was genuine. A person can be profoundly changed by love and still be destabilized by losing it. The compassionate response allows both truths. Bob helped James build a different life. Bob's death caused real pain. The bond remains meaningful without guaranteeing permanent protection from every future struggle. Perhaps that is the most mature version of hope. Not the promise that suffering will never return, but the knowledge that care has already expanded what a person can do. Losing that companion could not be edited into an inspiring montage. Grief does not respect a redemption arc. It can reactivate fear, loneliness, and instability. It can make old coping mechanisms feel dangerously close. The humane response is not to demand that James remain the hero of an uplifting story. It is to recognize that recovery includes periods when the person does not look inspirational. Support matters most when the headline has ended. Bob's legacy is therefore not a guarantee that everything stayed fixed. It is evidence that relationship can change what a person believes he is capable of. James had spent years caring for Bob. That history could not prevent grief, but it remained proof of commitment, tenderness, and endurance. The relationship was real even when the public story became complicated. Perhaps it was most real then. Chapter 9. The invisible chapter companionship opened. The photograph most people remember is simple: a man, a cat, and a London street. Outside the frame are the antibiotics bought with nearly the last money James had, the buses Bob followed him onto, The magazines sold one by one, and the mornings when responsibility arrived before hope. James was not invisible because he lacked a remarkable story. He was invisible because people had not stopped long enough to see it. Bob gave strangers a reason to pause. What they found was a person already trying to return to life. Sometimes the first step out of an invisible chapter is not being rescued. It is being needed. And sometimes the smallest companion can make the future feel close enough to reach. There is another lesson in the way strangers responded to Bob. Many people found it easier to approach an animal than a person marked by homelessness and addiction. The cat softened the encounter. He gave them permission to be curious rather than afraid. That reaction is understandable, but it asks something uncomfortable of us. Why did a cat have to make James visible? How many people pass through the same streets without a charming companion, a camera-ready image, or a story that can become a bestseller? Human dignity should not depend on being unusually talented, photogenic, or fortunate. James deserved safety before the book deal. He deserved to be spoken to before Bob became famous. The extraordinary outcome should not distract from that ordinary truth. The best way to honor the story is not to wait for another miracle. It is to notice the structures that made change possible and the gaps that keep others trapped. Housing gave James a base. Treatment gave recovery a path. Work gave him a public role. Bob gave the path emotional meaning. Companionship did not replace those things. It helped James use them. Years later, people still remember the ginger cat on a man's shoulder. The image lasts because it compresses trust into a single frame. Bob appears relaxed. James appears responsible for someone beyond himself. The city moves around them, but they are not alone. Outside the frame is the longer story. Money spent on medicine, difficult mornings, repeated routes, magazines held in cold hands, treatment continued, strangers slowly becoming familiar, and a future rebuilt through choices too ordinary to become viral. Those are the chapters worth seeing. Every person you pass carries a chapter you cannot see.